fairly, this has been coming for a while. This has been coming even since before the pandemic. But post-pandemic, theater is totally collapsing. Um, so just to read a little bit, evidence of the turmoil mounts day by day as companies from California to New York announce major cutbacks in their offering or shut down altogether. The theater world was further rocked recently when one of the nation's largest companies, the Los Angeles-based Center Theater Group, said it would pause programming in one of its theaters, the Mark Taper Forum. That followed the upheaval at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, another industry mainstay, which said last month it needed an emergency infusion of $7.5 million, or its 2023 season could not go on. The urgent effort came after a similar plea in April, for which OSF raised $2.5 million. The cutbacks and closings have been so regular of late that a document circulates among leaders of the field listing recent permanent closures, such as Triad Stage in North Carolina, Southern Repertory Theater in New Orleans, New Ohio Theater in New York, and staff and program downsizings. And speaking of Joe Papp, coming up, the Public Theater, which he founded. In June, Off-Broadway's Public Theater eliminated its Under the Radar Festival, which set an industry standard for avant-garde and international plays. To save money, even August companies such as Arena Stage, working with what its leaders call deficit planning, are reducing the number of plays they produce. And just last week, Chicago's 35-year-old Looking Glass Theater Company, debut theater for Tony-winning director Mary Zimmerman's Metamorphosis, declared that it was ceasing operations until late next spring. As regional theaters are often the seeding ground for both new play development and work that eventually goes to Broadway, every pause can have consequences down the road. Okay, so I can say as a theater person, this has been coming for a long time. You somewhat have a generational change, very similar to if you've ever gone to the symphony. You only have people who are like 73 there.
Right.
Like, look, for my grandparents, they went to the theater, right? When Death of a Salesman opened, that was a cultural event. You had to go see Death of a Salesman. There is no such thing anymore. There is no such thing as a Broadway show that is part of the cultural conversation in that way. Right. So theater just hasn't occupied that place in society since my grandparents' day. Now, their children, the boomers, because their parents were into theater like that, doing a kind of avant-garde experimental theater was a big part of the counterculture. So you did have that with the Living Theater and, Mabou Minds and all of these groups. And you had what Joseph Papp was doing, where he was trying to open it up to more people. By the time you get to my theater days, Gen X, it kind of fit the do-it-yourself thing that Gen X had going on, right? I mean, they were kind of into these very handmade, cheap things. And also because the boomers had done it. So, there was some element of that. As soon as you get smartphones, as soon as the internet streaming really became a meaningful way to distribute content, once it really became possible to just start throwing your stuff onto YouTube, a lot of that whole scene started to just completely collapse. Like the whole, even talent that wants to be involved in it just completely disappeared. And now you have the pandemic. Very much like with movies. People don't want to go to movie theaters. They don't really want to go to theaters anymore either. Now, an element of this that this doesn't get into, but it's part of my personal observation from people I know who are still in the business, who are struggling to get audiences back. I said this was going to happen before the theaters even reopened. The most COVID neurotic fucking people are the people who go to see theater still. It's lips. You don't have a conservative audience really for this stuff. It's basically lips.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And I just want to say something about the chat because a lot of people were mentioning Hamilton. Hamilton, you're right, is the closest thing to what would be like a water cooler type zeitgeist cultural event. But it's not the same because it's very expensive. People are priced out. There's only a certain cohort of people who can actually afford to go and see it. The era that Russell's talking about is the era of, don't forget, Times Square was a seedy part of town, right? Theater was a working person's thing to do. Right. I mean, it was not this luxury experience the way Hamilton is, or even even the most successful plays like Wicked and Book of Mormon and things like that. Right. It takes a certain person with a certain amount of money in the bank to be able to take the family for $600 to go and see Wicked or, whatever. Back in the day, Russell's talking about working people would go to the theater.
Right.
Everybody
my grandfather
could do it. So
it
was more of a right. It was a cultural event. It was a more cultural event. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's why I mentioned my grandparents, because they weren't like these, upper class people.
Right.
And they saw Death of a Salesman. I tell you, my grandfather would tell me about going to see these iconic shows from that era. It was a big deal back then. Like, who can name a modern playwright anymore? Like we can. Back then, people would have known Arthur Miller. Man, that would have been a big deal.
He was famous. Right?
Of course.
Married Marilyn Monroe, right? I mean, they were stars back then. Yeah.
So it does get into the pandemic a little bit, but it gets into it more. This article is arguing that they got used to not going to theater, which I would agree with. That's part of it, just as with movies. People got out of the habit of going. One thing that they do get into, and I don't want to say it's just this. I've often said that one of the great tragedies of my life has been watching the arts community become one of the most pro-censorship sectors of society. It's just absolutely crazy to me. And a big part of that is because as it's become so expensive to do and such by definition an elite art form, it's just been overrun by trust fund kids and Yale graduates and rich kids. Like when I first got into theater, you had people who were from the streets of St. Louis who slept in the theater. Who really had you really don't have those kinds of people anymore. And as a result, they don't have Joseph Papp's perspective on what diversity means. They have a woke perspective on what diversity means, which this is very revealing to me. So
their version of diversity is basically guilt management for them. Right.
Well, it's all very niche identity groups.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Rather than so he envisioned this is a artistic director that was hired for the Long Wharf Theater that's leaving its theater space but trying to continue as a company. He envisioned Long Wharf expanding its reach to underserved communities. This has meant offerings such as Black trans women at the center. Wow, that's going to bring them in. A multi-year digital festival of new work and I Am Muslim/American, a film by Aliyah Miller and Halima Flynn that Long Wharf has taken for talkback sessions across Connecticut. So this also gets into how a lot of their donors pulled out because they're starting to produce this kind of work that the donors really don't want to support. Now, when you look at the Papp era, when you look at descriptions, which actually the book I recommended has some descriptions of this, when he brought Shakespeare to Queens and dropped it into parks in Queens, those audiences were very diverse.
That was the whole point. Well, that was the whole point. Yeah.
That was why he did it. That was why he did it. He was thinking, how do you get this work to people who are never going to pay money coming. Look, when you grow up outside of Manhattan, when you're talking specifically in the New York context, we don't call it Manhattan if you grow up in Queens. You call it the city.
The city, yep.
Right?
Exactly.
And unless you work there, you only go there for an event. It's like an event. You go to the, when I was a little kid, the only time I was in the city, they would bring me to Barnum and Bailey's circus. Right. Once a year, I would go to the circus. Otherwise, I wasn't in the city. So Pap recognized that. He was a native New Yorker. He was like, they're not going to come to the city to see Shakespeare. So you got to bring it to them, put it right in their neighborhood where they're going to come see it, and make it free. Make it free so there's no economic obstacle. It says a lot to me that reaching out to diverse audiences, reaching out to underserved communities, it doesn't even seem to have occurred to them to do that, to do anything like that. If they were sitting there saying, yeah, we're going to start doing work in the projects with kids in the projects, we're going to train them in theater. And honestly, I'm not saying nobody's doing that. I don't see anybody doing that. Whenever these theaters say they're going to diversify, it's shit like this. It's
putting on shows that sort of assuage the guilt and anxiety of a white upper class audience. That's what it is.
And a lot of their audience, a lot of their donors, because this is the thing with these regional theaters, these are not commercial enterprises. Their financial model is completely dependent on having their donors give them money. They're all not-for-profit theaters, and subscriptions. Selling subscriptions. So you start to reorient your programming around stuff that doesn't really speak to people. Well, now you're asking them to donate as kind of a tithing. Now you're turning your project into a church, right? They have to come and worship this ideology because now you're pushing an ideology.
Right. And especially since, look, the history of American theater, there's a lot of radical playwrights and radical plays. Lorraine Hansberry was a socialist. Raisin in the Sun was the only real work she ever did. She died of cancer very, very young. Mm-hmm. That has a lot of themes of capitalism and business and alcoholism and abortion, religion, all this stuff. That's not a radical play, but you had August Wilson, radical black writer, Leroy Jones, even nowadays, Susan Laurie Parks, Top Dog Underdog, even a play like Rent. Rent was a major hit. It was a major sensation. That's a pretty gutsy play. Rent is an amazing piece of work that takes on some really difficult issues in a very head-on, emotionally just devastating way. It's a really fantastic piece of theater. And so, you've always had that. Now, it strikes me, especially when I would go and see like new works, a lot of it is just superficial virtue signaling to an upper-class white audience.
That's it.
That's how it plays.
That's it. And that is your audience. And when they diversify to the extent that they diversify the people working in the organization, it's not class diversity. They'll try to get more non-white people, which is still a challenge, honestly, when you look at who runs these things. Yes. But they're from the same privileged backgrounds that the white people are from. They're not from the lower classes. They're not from the working classes. And the result is, if you look at what few indie theaters are left today and you look at what their performance schedule is, it's monologues about being gay. It's monologues about being trans. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing else. It's not that there's no room for that.
Right.
It's that's it. Like that's your whole programming. It's basically, it took longer to get to the theater. This happened in the fine arts a while ago, where every gallery exhibit has to be about the challenge of intersectional identities facing blah 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 blah. And now it hit the theater communities because it's been overrun by the same social class. So that's definitely an element of why people aren't going. There's definitely other things, the pandemic, the way it shifted habits, generational, and the same thing to a certain extent that movie theaters are facing. I will say, in terms of big picture with all of this, you'll hear this argument more from people who are perceived as being conservative. Again, who knows what that means anymore. A lot of people will point out that people who are isolated and alone are easier to propagandize to and control. Now, I'm not saying that that's by design, but what I will say is this is not really a good development for psychological health and for human community, that we're gradually abandoning a lot of the things that people used to do together as a community. Now, you might say concerts. People are never going to go to concerts the way they used to go to a movie, right? Like it's just too involved. It's too expensive. That's another thing. I mean, the first time I went to a concert, I was 13. The ticket was $13.50. It was totally affordable.
It's what we talked about with SAG, right? If the bands can't make money selling albums anymore, they're going to charge a lot more money for the concert. And now you're not going to be able to afford to go to the concert, which means the only way to consume the music is by yourself on a streaming service that you pay $9 a month for, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
You've made so many of these things out of reach of the average person. And also the availability of the technology has made it such that people are highly demotivated to go someplace and do something. You see it in the nightclub culture too. Nightclubs are gone, basically.
Yeah, they're gone.
When was the last time you had a popular club even in New York? There was in every decade. There was
that scene dried up when I got married.
Yeah. No, you had Studio 54, you had the Limelight. Like every decade there was a defining club. And now there's no such thing because people don't, I was producing at the Cutting Room, which is still open because it's co-owned by Chris Noth, so because he's willing to pour money into it. But the guy who really runs it, he would tell me a lot because he came out of the whole nightclub scene going back to the 80s. They say, the only reason we're able to stay open is because we rent out for events.
Right.
And I would see, like, their nightclub fare, really not much of an audience.
Please clap.